In this session of the Purple Coffee podcast, I talked to Isla Wilson of Ruby Star about listening to people and the dangers this holds, and a few writing prompts I've come up with. Welcome to session 14 of the Purple Coffee podcast, inspiring stories from creative entrepreneurs. I am your host, Turndog, and I'm delighted to share today's edition, which features Isla Wilson, who is the main woman behind Ruby Star Associates, which is a marketing branding firm that gives a little oomph to your business. Oh yes, we could all do some oomph, especially in the morning when the coffee's not quite kicked in. I'm truly excited to share Isla's story and her big mistake, which, as it often is in aid of my book, The Success Mistake, a book for entrepreneurs featuring successful entrepreneurs. And it's something that I went through myself in the very beginning, to an extent still do. It's the age-old problem of listening to other people. Yes, we always search for other folks' advice. Yes, we listen to mentors and those who have been there and done it. But too often they say, oh, well, you need to do this. You need to wear these kind of clothes to a meeting. You need to close a deal in such a manner. Yet the true successful way to go about it is to stay true to your brand. And if you're listening to other people for the sake of it and it's going against your personality, the brand you've built, the way you go about things, then ultimately it won't work, at least the majority of the time. And this is exactly what Isla found. Like I say, I dealt with this in the beginning. I started wearing clothes I felt I had to wear, whereas once I let go of this silly perception and started wearing the clothes I wanted to wear and started acting the way I wanted to act, things became much easier and a great deal less stressful. Does everyone like me? Hell no. The majority of people don't, I'm sure. But those who do like me because I'm being who I am, and that is very important indeed. So I'm excited to share this interview with you. I'm sure you'll take a great deal from it. But first, I would like to talk about the post I released just a couple of days ago on turndogmillionaire.com. If you've not checked out the post yet, I encourage you to do so, especially if you are of a creative mindset, because I've released 20 rather quirky writing prompts, which I hope will kickstart your creativity. Now, it is aimed for the writer, but it doesn't have to just be in a writing form. These are cues that are aimed to kickstart your creativity. So whether it's in a speaking form or video or drawing, whether it's writing for fiction or non-fiction or blogging or whatever it might be, I hope that these prompts will help give your creativity an injection. It's something I need from time to time. Some days I feel so creative I could take on the world and destroy Picasso himself. And other days I feel beyond useless. So when I feel useless, I turn to things like writing prompts, because if anything else, they give me a bit of a kick up the butt, and before long, my brain starts to twinkle into place. So I hope you enjoy that. I'm going to share the link on this session's blog post. So if you type in bit.ly/purplecoffee14, you will be taken there. Otherwise, just head to turndogmillionaire.com and you will see it just a couple of posts down the page. So, yeah. Okay, so let's move on to this interview with the wonderful Isla Wilson. But who is Isla Wilson? Well, she lives in a city fairly close to me. She's in the Manchester area, so chances are if you're listening or watching this podcast from America, you won't have any idea where that is or who Isla is. So I've created a bit of a bio in a way only I can, so I shall share that with you now. Isla Wilson and her team at Ruby Star. Who is Ruby Star? Is it Isla? Is it some mystery woman we will never see but is always watching? Unimportant, because Isla claims to offer you some oomph, and let's face it, we could all do some added oomph to our day. Like a strong black coffee for your business, Isla and her mavericks help get your brand to where it needs to be. Isla also happens to own a rather spiffy red hat and pulls it off like no other. In fact, it's so red is that wonderful hat that I associate with the name Ruby. Isla equals Ruby. Ruby equals Isla. We may never know, but you'll learn some more about the main woman herself in this very interview. So let me pass it over to the Skype gods. I'm delighted to be joined today by Isla Wilson of Ruby Star Associates. Isla, thank you very much for joining us, first of all.
No worries at all.
Isla's very kindly joined us for an interview in aid of the successful mistake, where I'm going to ask her about some of the mistakes she's made, but then how she overcame them and became the awesome success that she is. So, Isla, to begin with, please just give us an overview of who you are and what it is that you do.
Isla Wilson. I'm the founder of Ruby Star Associates, which is an oomph agency. So we work about 50-50 with profit-making businesses and non-profit distributing social enterprises and charities to help them innovate, grow, and get their message out better. So it's very sales focused, really, but we use the word oomph because nobody likes sales, and because so much of what is out there in the market about sales and selling is inaccurate and unhelpful. So we wanted to sort of start with a blank page.
Nice, and I love the kind of little thing on the website, and it gives something which is very everyday and people try and avoid. It's like, I don't like the idea of sales, but you give it a catchy little sound, and you think, well, I can tackle that, I can do this. So yeah, I like that. So you've obviously been doing this for a little while now. How long is it that you've been doing it for?
This company is actually relatively new, so we're 2 years old at Ruby Star. And so I've previously been director and shareholder of another consultancy doing something a bit different. And before that, I was a management consultant. Yeah, it's like telling people you're the tax man, isn't it?
I hope it's not as bad as that, because I have to do some consultancy, and I don't want to ever be associated with the tax man.
No. So yeah, so this is quite new, Ruby Star. And within Ruby Star, we have a separate kind of stream, which is very linked to what we do, but it's called the Accidental Business School. And that is specifically our product for people who they want to make a living doing what they love. And that for them is a strong drive, a strong passion, but isn't something that makes them feel like a business person all of a sudden. So the idea of having to kind of adopt this kind of pinstriped persona is really frightening and off-putting to them, but they still want to make more of a living than they are, and they want to pick up the sort of, I guess, the bare minimum number of skills they need to thrive and grow without having to suddenly adopt a whole lot of jargon.
And it's a growing market because we're hearing all the time that there's more entrepreneurs coming in due to everything from the fact that people can't get jobs or they're getting made redundant, but also because the ease to get involved now with the online world.
Yeah.
This whole idea of the unintentional entrepreneur comes around, where you just start a hobby, you sell it on eBay or Etsy, and then a couple of years down the line, you have this business, and you think, how am I a business person? I'm not a business person, I'm a designer, or I make jewelry or I make clothes. So having that outsource and that outlet to help these people is obviously a fantastic thing.
Yeah, it is. And I think a lot of those people wouldn't initially self identify as an entrepreneur, and they wouldn't identify even as a business person. So we quite often do sort of themed events. So we're doing for the second time actually the Accidental Business School for disc jockeys in a few months. And disc jockeys identify as disc jockeys, but they are obviously self-employed business people and need some of those skills. And likewise, when we've done it for dancers or comedians, they really associate with that label, and everything else is very much secondary to that, as it should be for them, really.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Well, you work with a kind of people that I absolutely love, the social entrepreneurs and the small and medium-sized enterprises of the world. You always find some fantastic stories from these people, and the journey is great. So I'm sure you have some excellent stories to share. Speaking of which, please tell us the tale behind the mistake you want to focus on, what happened, and then how you turned it all
around. The mistake that it took me a long time to kind of choose just one mistake, but there's a theme to several of my mistakes, and I think that's what I've gone with, really. As I kind of started in my career, I was working with very big businesses, and as I still do now. And there is a degree of kind of rhetoric and kind of mythology around business. And in big businesses, it's quite easy to be part of that and it not be an issue. But actually, in small business, that's, I think, quite unhelpful. And one of the things I noticed through running small businesses and working with small businesses is that when we aren't sure of ourselves and when we are new at something, we often have a tendency to kind of to Google it, to talk to people, to network. And there is often a very, very strong move towards certain solutions. And that can be a really useful way of informing your thinking. But I think for me, my mistake has always been when I have followed that without seeking broad evidence. So sales is very much an example of that, both in my experience and in what I do now. There are certain things which are just accepted as kind of a given good, and when you actually dig into the external evidence for them, they don't add up. A really good example is things like closing techniques. I used to worry about how to close a sale. You get to kind of the end of a meeting. There's a kind of an awkward bit where you think I have to say something now, and I would have kind of anxiety about that. And I looked for solutions to that anxiety, and the kind of accepted mythology around that is that you close the sale at that point. Now, actually, that isn't what the evidence says. If we look at the most recent evidence in sales, we know that closing techniques damage profit, they damage customer trust, and they make salespeople feel kind of crappy about themselves. So they're not a good thing. But if you just looked for what the answer to that problem is, you'd get that as the solution. And it's only when you dig behind it for the evidence that you find out that actually there are a whole range of other activities that might not only be more comfortable and more creative and fit better with your brand, but are also more effective. And there are so many points in my career, in the businesses I've been involved with, where we've not stopped, taken a step back and checked for more evidence. And we've kind of assumed that if enough people are talking about it, it must be the right way to do it.
And I particularly touch on this because I've always stood by the thing of listen as much as you can, but you need to be a filter. You need to think, right, what is right for me? Because just because expert A, B, and C are saying this is the way forward, it doesn't mean that it will work for you. And you have to take a step back and think, right, how can this work for me as a brand, as an individual? Can I get on board? And research is part of that. And I suppose it comes down to a lot of the time, these mantras, it's he who shouts loudest.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get carried away by an inspirational talk and you think, yes, that's perfect. But without doing the groundwork behind it, it might be a little false, a little lifeless.
And the world is full of experts who are very definite about the solution. But I think a great skill to learn for anybody is just to always ask for the evidence of it. You will find lots of people, for instance, who will massively advocate that if you have an online business, you need a squeeze page where you capture details, you give a free gift. And most of those people won't be able to provide evidence as to why that works. They can say that it's worked for them. Further questioning will often reveal that they've never tested anything else. So it may work, but there's no way of knowing if things work better. Equally, what's very rarely in that evidence that they produce is information about how it works. So is that a really effective way to collect email addresses? Or is that a really effective way to build long-term relationships with your customers? Or is it a really effective way to sell one particular product once? And all three of those outcomes are very different. And knowing that something works isn't enough. You have to know what it works for and whether that's what you really want.
Okay. So did you find yourself kind of, I suppose, chasing your tail and running around in circles a bit where you would try something because it's the done thing to do, and then after a few months you were realizing it wasn't work, so you moved on to the next done thing and then the next, and then one day did you kind of just think, we need to actually just think what's going to work for us?
Actually, no, that isn't what I did, but I have seen lots and lots of people do that. And there are lots of kind of latest big thing approaches to business out there that, I think everybody would be able to think of somebody they know who works in that way. What I did was no more effective, but different, which is that I pretty much continued to do what was working for me and what I was comfortable with, and just internalized all the insecurity. So I sort of thought, well, I am rubbish at selling because I'm not doing closing techniques. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing that. I'm not going for no or whatever the latest thing was. I'm doing it my way. And what I was very bad of and bad at, and I think this is quite common, was to then look at the evidence. So actually, what we were doing was very effective. We were generating really great sales doing that thing. And when we did experiment with some of the more conventional things, we got worse. And yet it took me far, far too long to accept that what we were doing was right for us and our customers. And it wasn't just a kind of weird coincidence that it happened to work sometimes. And that internalizing of kind of internalizing the kind of insecurity rather than looking at the techniques is very common. People think they're bad when they've had bad advice.
Yeah, so you were kind of giving yourself a hard time in your head because you weren't doing what's said to be done. You weren't following the ABC of closing and everything and all these things. But actually, the whole time, if you look at the evidence, it was working for you.
Yes, and also that it was a very emotional moment when we started to research some of these things and found out that actually it's not even just a weird quirk that doing it differently was working for us. That's what the evidence says should happen. Yeah. So when we actually look at the up-to-date evidence about how people buy, what works and what doesn't, it completely matched what we were doing. But rhetoric in sales and in all areas of business and in other areas is often based on a grain of truth that is either misapplied or evidence that is old. So that particular set of messages comes from very, very outdated research. And if you ask somebody to produce the research for that, some people can, but if you look at the dates on the research they're presenting, it's very, very old stuff. And actually, there is much more recent learning that tells us that something else is more likely to work, and we don't consistently look for that. We're very accepting of what people tell us works for them.
Very interesting. And I suppose this has helped you in two forms, because on the one side it's helped you grow your own business and do what you do, but because your entire sort of world is designed around helping others, I guess you've been able to provide better advice as a result.
I really hope so. Yeah, I think
fingers crossed.
We certainly provide different advice, and it would be lovely to have all the answers. What we try and do is keep as up to date as we can with the research and to access it and to review it and apply it. There will always be exceptions. So one of the biggest things that we do with our clients is encourage them to keep their own data and test their own ideas. Just because something works on average doesn't mean it will work for everybody. But starting with the things that work on average, I think, is in general a better place to start. So starting by testing something where there is evidence to suggest that in general that is more likely to work than other things is really good. And it's kind of freeing for people to not necessarily have the answer, but to have a structure in which to experiment and find a mix of what's right for their business and what's right for them. And sometimes to decide, even if something works, not to do it because they don't like it, and there are other things that maybe don't work quite as well but work well enough, but give them something else in their business.
Absolutely. And like you say, it's a fantastic starting point because it gives you a bit of direction. You're starting where there's evidence that says actually this does work for some people. Yeah. But I suppose the important mindset is to tweak it. Find a way to make it apply for you, not something that's going to apply for everyone else. And if you have to, break some rules along the way, then that's perfectly fine, because the only right rules are the ones which are relevant to you.
Yeah. I mean, social media is a really good example of that for us. I was an extremely reluctant tweeter. I was kind of almost forced into it by colleagues who were like, we have to do this. This is the way forward. And because I didn't really want to do it in some ways, I didn't follow the rules, and I didn't start by having training in how I should do it. And for me and for my brand, that was the right choice. So we still do a huge amount of things which are the opposite of what social media experts advise. But the limited amount of experimentation that we do in that suggests that when we do the right thing, we get worse results for us. And by not doing the right thing, we have not only generated a kind of a Twitter community that works well for us, that gives us what we need in terms of information and which bluntly generates sales for us. But we also, or I also, have come to enjoy it and like it, because I could only have ever liked it on the terms we work on now. I wouldn't have been happy with the other terms. And so there's a bit of a balance there between, I think the main thing with it is always to be able to do it consistently, and that requires you to enjoy it sometimes.
Can you give us an example of that, how you use Twitter in that sort of way, which is a bit anti sort of regular?
I mean, we're not massive kind of revolutionaries, but I think a lot of people are quite careful on Twitter, and we're not necessarily, and we're lucky because our brand isn't necessarily a very careful one, so we can be maybe a bit braver in that sense. We do use scheduling, which I know a lot of people really dislike, and I understand why, but that has been the main thing that has allowed us to connect with people internationally, because we tweet when we're asleep through scheduling. And we've also seen that by using some repeated scheduling, which again is hated, but we have tweets that maybe go out every 6 months, some that go out every 3 months. And we regularly hear from customers that it was, they saw it and it kind of registered and thought, I have that problem. But it wasn't maybe till the second or the third time that they started to associate that problem and the solution and us. And it was those three things happening that caused them to pick up the phone. And one tweet wouldn't have done that for them.
Scheduling, I think, gets a bad rap, because if you just schedule everything and you are a robot with it, then that's obviously the bad way to go. But as long as you're still interacting as a sort of individual, and scheduling is just kind of built around that, scheduling makes sense, because like you say, we sleep, but we live in a global world. There's certain things where you might forget to send that tweet, but if you send a tweet every 4 or 5 days about a particular subject, it registers in people's mind. I suppose you just have to find a way to make it work for you, and it sounds like that's what you've done.
And you're right, it's about balance, I think. So a lot of people say social media is not for selling, and I know what they mean when they say that, but I think that simplifies the message. It's not just for selling, and you have to be there, you have to interact, and it has to be personal. But equally, if I actually track the tweets that drive action, it's the ones that say what we do, what it costs, and how to get involved. And those are our sales tweets. People wouldn't read them if they didn't trust us in other ways, if they didn't enjoy the interaction. But if I didn't put them out there, then we wouldn't get business from it. And it's very hard for most small businesses to justify spending any degree of time on something that doesn't in some way add to the bottom line.
Yeah. And it's always been sort of my tough one from a marketing point of view, because you've always got MDs who want to see that red line. So I suppose to sum things up, your mistake stemmed from you were trying to follow what other people were doing, giving yourself a hard time when you weren't. But the fact that you followed and stayed true to your brands and what you were building and who you are, it actually took you down a really good path.
Almost that. And the only thing I changed is that I don't even think we were particularly trying to follow it. We just were hearing that we should be doing it differently, and not necessarily then changing what we were doing, but just thinking, goodness, are we daft? Everybody else seems to be doing it this way, and I can't imagine how that would work for us. And so the mistake wasn't that we tried to follow all those things. The mistake was that we didn't soon enough to question it and say, well, should we be following this? Does this make any sense? Is there a good reason why that would work generally? And then is there a good reason why, given that, it would work for us? And it was just that thought that we didn't have for too long, really.
And I think that's very good advice for young entrepreneurs and new entrepreneurs in particular. Be a little bit like a child, where you're questioning everything. You're always going to be asking, yeah, but why? Yeah, but why? Why is that the case? Why should I do that? Because there's so much advice and information out there that if you listen to everything, or if you even attempted to listen to half of it, you would just run around in circles being a complete chaotic mess. You'd never get anything done. So I think listen, sure, but certainly question as much as you can and think what will be relevant to me.
Yeah, and have mentors. I'm a big believer in people having mentors, but give them a really hard time, and don't ask advice necessarily from people who expect you to follow it. I'm really lucky to have lots of people in my life professionally who I ask for advice and who give me that advice on the basis that I will ask several people for advice, and that I will very possibly ignore all or most of it or some of it, but that I will really value the process of having lots and lots of different people's experiences, opinions, and evidence, and then deciding to make my own mistakes anyway. And I think it's hard if you ask people for advice who expect you to follow it. There's a different relationship there.
Yeah, you don't want people getting hurt feelings in them situations, but you have to follow the right stuff. So before we end this wonderful interview, if you could offer one piece of advice to a young/new entrepreneur who's just starting out on this crazy journey that we all try and be part of, what piece of advice would it be?
Keep your own data, I think, is the biggest thing. When we start a business, it can be quite frightening to have the cold hard facts about how it's going, but it's the only thing that helps us to make really smart decisions. And very simple things like the fact that particularly people who've left corporate life, there's some things we're really pleased to leave behind, like timesheets, and kind of budgeting and financial analysis. But for most of us in small business, when we start, the only things we control are the time we spend and the money we spend. And not having a decent record of that really inhibits our analysis of what's worked and what hasn't. And so I'm, for instance, a huge believer in timesheets. There's great free applications out there to let you do it. Not to analyze the time you spend with clients, although you may have to do that if that's how you bill, but to analyze what you do in the rest of the time and what that means 3 months down the line and 6 months down the line in terms of what comes through the pipeline, I think is vital. And it's quite a tricky discipline to get into. Startup phase tends to be chaotic. It tends to be very exciting. It tends to feel like every lead is likely to turn into something. But when you're a year in and you suddenly realize you do need that data, then it's much harder to backtrack and work out what you actually did.
Very good advice. Yeah, and that's something probably I fail on from time to time. I need to listen to that myself, I think. Well, thank you very much, Isla. It's been a wonderful talk. Your insight has been wonderful. Viewer, thank you indeed for watching, and hopefully the advice on offer today has been superb. I've certainly learned a great deal. So Isla, thank you.
You're welcome. That was fun.
Okay, cheers.
Okay, and there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, another session of the Purple Coffee Podcast at an end. And a huge thank you to Isla for being part of both this podcast and the Successful Mistake in general. I loved speaking to her. It's always great to speak to a fellow local-ish entrepreneur, and the things she went through during these issues are things that I sympathise a great deal with, and I'm almost certain you do too. When you start out a business, you're always asking people for their opinions, and rightly so. We need mentors, we need those who have been there and done it. But just because it works for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And just because a book that says you have to sell in this way, or you need to market like that, or you need to be on Twitter, you need to be on LinkedIn, it's all craziness. You need to do what's right for you and your brand, and if it doesn't suit your personality, it doesn't suit your vision, it will all crumble into pieces. And I think this is exactly what Isla talks about, and I'm sure you've picked up some tips. I know I have, and once I started embracing my own personality and staying true to the Turn Dog brand, things became easier. Not necessarily easy, but certainly easier. And that's it, session 14 at an end. I hope you will head over to bit.ly/Purple Coffee 14 and check out links to Isla and her Ruby Star World. And I also hope you will consider subscribing to this very podcast once there. If you enjoy watching on your laptop or screen of some kind, you should follow the Vimeo channel. And if you like to listen, maybe on your phone on the way to work, well, the iTunes channel is ideal for you. And if you like things delivered to your inbox before anybody else, full of exclusive content, then the email list. That's right, it's for you. All that information is at purplecoffee14 on the bit.ly site, and that's all there is to it. So thank you indeed for watching/listening. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, and I hope you will reach out to me soon and let me know your thoughts. So until next time, keep it cool, cats.